Van witnessed a person's death for the first time over a year ago when she was still in Vietnam. Witnessing someone's death meant seeing them suddenly transition from the realm of the living to the other side. It was Mr. Th, who lived 3 houses down the small alley in Ward 10, Tan Binh district. Van wasn't familiar with Mr. Th simply because he was a neighbor. Their lives were separate and they rarely crossed paths, especially considering that Mr. Th was much older than Van. If addressing him correctly, Van should have called him uncle. However, the reason Van was acquainted with him was that he was the bus driver on the route from Van's home to her workplace. Whether she liked it or not, Van had to encounter him at least once every morning. Taking the bus was a popular mode of public transportation, and every trip was packed. However, when Vietnam transitioned to a market economy, Saigon residents rushed to buy motorcycles. Additionally, motorbike taxis became popular, causing buses to gradually become less in demand due to their slow progress on congested streets where few respected traffic laws. Only passengers without other means of transportation, like Van, had no choice but to rely on the bus. Since the bus was empty, whenever Van stepped on board, Mr. Th would happily engage in casual conversation, although he was not allowed to talk while driving. Van would respond cheerfully, choosing an empty seat near him to chat and forget about the journey to her workplace. Generally, it was just customary small talk, but occasionally, if something unusual happened in Van's alley, the two would have a new topic to discuss. Mr. Th was unmarried and had no children. He lived with his older brother's family, sharing household registration and considering his brother's family as his own. At the age of 45, Mr. Th had a weathered and troubled face, dark skin, and his hair in the front was slightly long, always falling onto his forehead, which irritated Van's eyes. He rarely smiled, although his smile was very bright. His teeth were even like corn kernels, but the unfortunate thing was that they always appeared yellow due to cigarette smoke. He had a heavy addiction to cigarettes, always carrying a pack of My cigarettes in his pocket, a type of locally made black tobacco that few people smoked. Whenever the traffic was congested, he would usually get out of the car and light up a cigarette, or sometimes just take a few puffs before getting back behind the wheel. The people of Saigon smoked a lot, so no one felt irritated or uncomfortable because of the cigarette smoke. One morning on the way to work as usual, Van was sitting right behind him, telling a story about catching an adulterer in the neighborhood, and the car was running smoothly when suddenly Van startled as the bus veered sharply to the right, then climbed onto the sidewalk, crashing into a tree trunk and coming to a stop. The engine was still running, but Mr. Th slumped over the steering wheel, causing the horn to blare continuously. Fortunately, there was a wide roadside curb with a large tree blocking the way, so the car didn't hit any pedestrians or crash into someone's house. Passengers were in a state of confusion, some standing up and some sitting down. Van shook Mr. Th's shoulder and anxiously asked, "Hey, did you lose control of the steering wheel, Mr. Th? Wake up." But no matter how much she shook him, he didn't respond. The passengers looked at each other in astonishment and then started to get off the bus to find alternative transportation for fear of being late for work. Some curious individuals, mostly regular passengers who took this route every day, gathered around with Van and lifted Mr. Th's head upright. Immediately, the sound of the horn ceased. Mr. Th turned his head to one side, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, and his eyes vacant but clearly devoid of life. People assumed he had fallen ill because, according to folklore, he was struck by a sudden gust of wind, and no one believed that he had actually died. Van looked around anxiously and asked, "Does anyone have any aromatic oil from paradise? Any kind of oil? Let me borrow it." The crowd, each person with their own statement. Goodness, someone should bother running up to the intersection and calling for an ambulance. Someone else said, call an ambulance instead of waiting for the police to arrive. People grabbed their hair, vigorously shook the man's shoulders, or pressed firmly on his chest, hoping to help him regain consciousness while waiting for the ambulance. But all efforts were in vain. Someone disappointedly said, it's no use. He's probably dead, definitely dead. He was hit by 100%. Oh my, the wind at this moment is so poisonous. With that observation, people scattered away from the car, distancing themselves to avoid any further trouble when law enforcement personnel arrived for questioning. However, Van couldn't leave, couldn't abandon her neighbor, as she clung to the thought that he hadn't completely died, just unconscious. She got out of the car, her face pale as she looked around, then waved down a motorized rickshaw and asked the driver to help bring Mr. Th down and transport him to the hospital. She said, hurry, hurry, maybe we can save him. He might be just having trouble breathing, not completely dead yet. Then she reached into her wallet to pay the rickshaw driver, but he looked puzzled at Van and asked, why didn't you go with him? If you didn't go together, I wouldn't have given him a ride. Just kidding, am I that stupid? Van pleaded. Sir, the poor man fainted. Please take him to the hospital for me. I still have to go to work. The rickshaw driver widened his eyes and replied. Fainted? He didn't faint. He died suddenly. I took him to the hospital, and they asked a lot of questions, you know. Only a family member would know how to answer. Van looked at Mr. Th once again, and indeed, he had passed away. Lifeless, lying slumped on the rickshaw, his head tilted to one side. His eyes remained wide open, and his mouth hung open. Van told the rickshaw driver, but I'm not a family member. The rickshaw driver was both surprised and annoyed, stamping his foot and shaking his head, grumbling to himself. But he remembered that he was in front of a woman, so he raised his voice. If you're not his family, what right do you have to demand taking him to the hospital? How foolish can a person be? And what will you say when the police ask about his death? How will you answer? Van suddenly realized that she had taken on the responsibility of taking care of the old man. Partly because she knew him and partly because she couldn't easily back out now that she was involved. She thought he had only fainted, so she felt compelled to find a way to help and called a cyclo to take him to the hospital. Little did she know that he had already crossed over to the other world. Since hearing that the old man, had passed away on the cyclo, Van suddenly felt a chill and couldn't bring herself to look at him anymore. But now, what could she do? Passers-by became more curious and crowded around because the cyclo driver was shouting and gesturing loudly. Frustrated, he said to Van, "You foolish woman. I've had enough bad luck this morning. Now you carry him and leave him on the bus. Whatever happens next is none of my business." With those words, he lifted the lifeless body and asked Van to support those legs. Hesitant, Van stood still. Only when the cyclo driver became more aggressive did she reluctantly join in, lifting the lifeless body onto the bus and placing it behind the driver's seat. The cyclo driver quickly drove off, cursing Van as a fool. Van got off the bus and stood hesitantly on the roadside, unsure whether to leave or wait for the police to arrive and give her statement. The crowd around her asked different questions, but Van absent-mindedly answered before deciding to take a Honda taxi to inform those family and go to the funeral home to make arrangements for his burial. Fate had arranged for Tho to die suddenly, and by chance, Van was the first person to witness his unexpected death while he was talking to her. Over a month ago, Van had proudly mentioned to Tho that she was waiting to settle in Canada with the sponsorship of her elder brother. Tho blinked and said, "Congratulations to you. But it's evident that there is a hint of sadness in your voice for your own fate, dreaming of going abroad without any way." Tho said to Van, "I've also heard that you're about to go abroad. People say that's why you haven't gotten married yet." Van laughed and replied, "Before I leave, my family will have a farewell gathering with relatives and neighbors. Please come and join us." "Yes, how generous of you. Just thinking about me makes me happy. I must come to bid you farewell." The story seemed like it was just yesterday. Van hadn't even left yet or had the chance to invite Tho to the gathering when he passed away. Van rushed home to inform her family, and together with her elder brother, they fetched Tho's body from the morgue, bought a burial plot at Tan Viet Cemetery near Bao. Van was present from the beginning to the end, from the preparation of the body to the burial. The funeral coincided with heavy rain and strong winds. The cemetery was located in a low-lying area, and the water overflowed. The coffin floated in the water, and people had to use sticks to push it down and fill the grave with soil. But no matter how much earth was piled on, it immediately turned into mud and washed away with the water. It was nearly a year later, Van embarked on her journey to Canada and temporarily stayed with a sponsored family, named Hayu, who had a wife and 3 children in Toronto. Hayu had purchased a new house before Van arrived, a newly built home located in the northern suburbs of Toronto, in an emerging area with relatively affordable prices and plenty of undeveloped land nearby. Behind Hayu's house, there was an empty lot covered in overgrown grass, followed by the edge of a forest. The vacant plot of land was also part of a plan for residential or condominium construction, but due to the temporary economic downturn and the real estate industry's recession, the project was put on hold. Hayu's family consisted of 5 people, but their 2 eldest children were away at university, residing in dormitories on campus. Thus, only the husband, wife, and their 14-year-old youngest daughter remained at home. Hayu and his wife occupied the main bedroom on the upper floor, while their daughter had her own room adjacent to theirs. Downstairs, next to the bathroom, there was a small room allocated for Van, located against the back wall and featuring a window overlooking the desolate empty land. As Van gazed daily at the barren and silent scenery behind the house, reminiscing about the bustling streets of Saigon, her sister-in-law urged her husband to find a job for Van. In truth, there was no need for her sister-in-law to push, as Hayu himself was actively seeking employment for Van, enabling her to have additional spending money and, most importantly, to avoid conflicts with his wife. Both Hayu and his wife were employed, so his wife became annoyed whenever she saw Van sitting idle at home. 3 months later, Hayu managed to find a job for Van at a 24-hour cafe called Dolnod, situated in the downtown area, which is the heart of the city of Toronto. They assigned Van to work the night shift, starting from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. Hayu comforted her with these words. "Well, just bear with it for now and eventually, after a while, you can switch to the day shift." They promised me that. The night shift might make you feel sleepy, but on the bright side, there are fewer customers compared to the daytime. Van replied cheerfully, "I have no problem with staying at home. It's so boring." He meticulously advised Van on the experiences of working in a foreign place to help her overcome any hesitation. Then, he guided Van on how to catch a ride to work. Since it was a newly developed suburban area, there were no buses in front of Hugh's house. Van would have to walk a considerable distance to reach the main road and catch a bus that would take her to the metro station. From there, she would have to take another bus to downtown, where she worked. Hugh planned that in a few months, Van would learn to drive and buy a used car, making it easier for her sister. Hugh handed Van an extra set of house keys and carefully instructed her to jot down the home phone number, the Dolnard shop's phone number, and Hugh's workplace phone number. He told her to keep them safe in her wallet for emergencies, especially if she got lost. Hugh said, "You'll be fine working the night shift. You won't have to wake up early in the morning, and you can sleep during the day as much as you want. The roads are not congested, and the buses are spacious, so you won't have to stand for long. Don't worry, I'll be here to support you." Knowing that her older brother was being sympathetic, Van concealed her emotions and replied, "Don't worry, any job will do for me. I'm used to hardships in Vietnam. Besides, learning English while working is faster than studying from books." The next morning, Van woke up earlier than usual, even though she didn't have to work until late in the evening. On her first day at work, she was nervous and couldn't sleep well. She tossed and turned for a while until Hugh and his wife came downstairs. His sister-in-law looked at Van with more affection because she had found a job and wouldn't be idle and dependent anymore, as she had been for the past 3 months. Although Van's job didn't pay much, she silently rejoiced since she no longer had to endure her sister-in-law's resentful glances. Hugh and his wife were getting ready to leave for work early, although their daughter didn't need to rush as she could go to school later. However, since they had the convenience of their parents' car, they decided to drop her off at school, saving her from walking. With everyone gone, Van sat alone having breakfast. She planned to sleep a little longer before getting up to cook dinner for the family. However, Hugh insisted that she should have a long nap and wake up just before it was time to leave for work. Van nodded in agreement, but once everyone had left, she found herself either watching TV or lost in thought outside the house before eventually going into the kitchen. She wanted to sleep, but sleep eluded her. On that evening, after finishing dinner, the whole family sat watching TV for a while, and then Van prepared to go to work. Wanting to be sure, she left the house at 9:30 so as not to be late. The end of November brought a chill and darkness fell quickly. It was only around 5 o'clock in the afternoon when the gloomy grayness set in, and in Toronto, by this time, the snow had already covered everything. This year the weather was dry, but the wind was biting, especially around Hugh's house where there were still many vacant lots. Van wore jeans, several layers of clothing, a scarf wrapped around her neck, she wore barter shoes, and carried a bag with food and a few miscellaneous items. She hesitantly made her way through the desolate and dimly lit streets until she reached the main road. Just as Hugh had said, at this hour, the people and cars had dwindled, so there was only one passenger waiting at the bus stop, an elderly Canadian lady sitting on the bench inside the glass shelter, anxiously looking towards the approaching bus. Van also stepped inside the glass shelter to shield herself from the wind. She nodded and greeted the lady, then sat down next to her, both facing the direction from which the bus would arrive. After about 5 minutes, she joyfully spotted the bus appearing faintly in the distance with its headlights. She quickly stood up, walked outside, and the elderly lady followed Van, huddling close to the curb. Van glanced at the large number displayed on the front of the bus and nodded with satisfaction because it was the correct bus number as instructed by Hugh. Being her first time taking the bus, she was afraid of getting lost and not knowing how to get back. The heavy bus rolled forward and pulled over to the curb. Van stood in front, one hand holding the bag of food, the other hand holding 2 cut coins. The elderly lady stood behind, muttering something in English with a difficult-to-understand accent. As the bus doors opened, Van eagerly stepped on board but suddenly froze in astonishment, gasping and trembling, as the bus driver was none other than Mr. Th, right in front of her. At this hour, he was sitting behind the wheel in Canada, turning his head to look at Van with a radiant smile. The only difference between the previous Mr. Th and the present one was that his face was no longer dark as before, but pale with a tinge of green, as if a layer of wax had been applied to his skin. His teeth were no longer yellowish but rather a pale white, resembling watercolor, making his smile look eerie. It must be Mr. Th, there was no mistaking it. Van turned pale, dropped the bag of food to the ground, staggered back a few steps, and then turned around and ran, horrified. The Canadian lady standing behind Van reached out and held onto Van's shoulders, asking in English, "What's wrong? What happened?" Van didn't understand anything, trembling, and it took her a while before she could utter a sentence in both English and Vietnamese. He died, he died, the bus driver has been dead for a long time." Then she turned around, ran with her head down, and the Canadian lady climbed up while looking at Van in surprise, muttering a few words that no one could understand clearly. After running quite a distance, she finally stopped in front of a row of shops. Van sat heavily on the steps next to a bakery that was preparing to close. Her breath was still heavy, and she vividly remembered Mr. Th's pale greenish face and sparkling white teeth when she had just stepped onto the bus, which sent a chilling sensation throughout her body, as if an unexpected gust of cold wind had pierced her bones. She couldn't be mistaken, Mr. Tho is dead. She herself attended the funeral and buried him at Tan Viet Cemetery, Bako. How is it possible that he is now driving a bus in Canada? Van hesitated, her mind confused, her face expressionless. She forgot about her surroundings to the point that the bakery next to her had to urge her to stand up so they could empty the trash, as she was sitting right next to the garbage bin. Van stood at the threshold, looking out onto the street. She remembered Hai's advice that there is a bus every 20 minutes in the evening. The rush hour for going to work and getting off work is faster. Van walked sluggishly, returning to the old station, waiting for the next bus. Being late on the first day would surely lead to scolding, and there was a possibility of losing her job without knowing what might happen. Van blinked and sighed, suddenly remembering the bag of food she dropped earlier. She looked down at the road, but the bag had been crushed by a passing car, losing its shape. Van sighed again as the chilly evening wind blew relentlessly. She stood in the glass-enclosed station, deserted, with no one but herself. After a while, from a distance, Van saw another bus gradually becoming clearer. She rolled up her sleeves, looked at her watch, and hoped to catch this bus in time to get to the Dolnod coffee shop. But suddenly, she had a thought that made her shudder, because who knows, the bus driver on that bus might actually be Mr. Tho. Clearly his spirit had followed her from Vietnam to here. Van widened her eyes, looking at the approaching bus, and when it was only about 100 feet away, due to a strong impulse within her, Van suddenly panicked and ran. She ran back to her old spot, where only a few shops were still open. She stood against the wall and stared intently. The distance was too far and it was getting dark. She couldn't see the bus driver's face, so she didn't know if it was Mr. Tho or not. She only knew that the bus was almost empty without any passengers. The bus departed, and Van stood there breathing heavily, not knowing what to do. If she took the bus, she was afraid of encountering Mr. Tho's ghost, but if she called a taxi, Van didn't know if she had enough money. She still didn't know how much it would cost to get to the city center from here. And even if she wanted to call a taxi, Van didn't know where to find the phone number. In the end, she decided to walk home and planned to let Hai know that she wouldn't be going to work today and asked Hai to call Dolnod coffee shop for her. She knew Hai would scold her, especially his wife, but Van had no other choice unless Hai personally drove her to work. Van walked hesitantly on the road, which had not yet been paved, winding through the empty land with overgrown grass that had started to wither due to the weather. She came here at the end of August when Toronto was still warm and sunny, but in just over 3 months, The bone-chilling cold had arrived so quickly, evoking memories of Saigon. But she had never really remembered Mr. Doe, even fleetingly. It wasn't until his spirit appeared to her just now that she vaguely remembered that in the stack of photos she carried, there was a picture of Mr. Doe's funeral, where she stood next to his relatives under the light rain after the burial. It meant that Mr. Doe was truly dead, lying deep in the ground, and she herself had taken him to the cemetery. So why is she here now? In this world, people may resemble each other, but they can't be alike, especially Vietnamese people. Who will be able to join the public bus driving profession? Van lowered her head and walked amidst the sound of the wind whistling and howling sporadically around the dark empty land, with a row of tan LP houses faintly visible, with dim lights, including High West House. Suddenly, Van realized that she was not the only person walking on this shabby, gravel-strewn path. There were clear footsteps of someone walking fast behind her, getting closer with each passing moment. The sound of forceful, masculine footsteps on the loose rocks was audible. Van slowed down, moving aside to let the person behind her pass. But the sound of footsteps remained behind her, refusing to move forward. Curiosity got the better of her, and when she turned back, she saw no one. The area around her was completely empty, without a single soul in sight. She shuddered and quickened her pace. Yet, the invisible footsteps continued to follow closely behind her. Gathering all her courage, she abruptly turned around again but still saw no one. There was no one in sight from all directions, only the wind blowing. Terrified, Van tried to run, but her feet seemed to be held back, preventing her from escaping. She struggled and rushed forward, stumbling and falling onto the road. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for breath, and ran straight towards the door. Van looked up in relief at the 3 steps leading to the entrance, clutching the key in her hand. The newly built row houses stood closely together, with one house just an arm's length away from the other. However, the road in front of her was wide and often deserted. Just as she was about to insert the key into the gate, she was startled because she caught a glimpse of a blurry figure of a man moving inside the house through the kitchen window curtain. It immediately reminded her of the ghostly figure of Mr. Th, but in reality, it was just Hayu fetching water from the refrigerator to bring upstairs. Hearing the sound of the key turning in the lock, Hayu was startled and stood still on the staircase, asking in both Vietnamese and English, "Who is it? Who opened the door?" Then he slowly stepped forward as the door opened, and Van appeared. Hayu asked in confusion, "Why are you back? Did you forget something?" Breathing heavily, Van replied vaguely, "Th there. I saw a ghost." On top of Hai West's wife's house, and little Enlin also came out and went downstairs. Hai knew that his sister was not the type to be lazy or avoid work, and he also noticed Van's pale face. However, he found her explanation unacceptable as it was beyond his imagination. He frowned and asked again, "What are you saying? You saw a ghost? Where did you see it? Why such a bizarre thing? There are no ghosts in Canada." As he spoke, Hayu approached and placed the cold water pitcher on the table. Van immediately grabbed his glass of water and drank it all, as her throat was parched. She leaned against the chair and sat down, while Hayu also sat across from her, staring into the abyss, although he clearly saw the lingering horror in Van's eyes. Hayu's wife and daughter approached, and everyone sat at the dining table. Seeing his wife beside him, Hayu reiterated the question, "Why did you come back while you were at work?" Van placed the glass on the table and said, "I told you before, but let me ask you, do you remember Mr. Th near our house? In the same alley as our house, 3 houses away from ours, do you remember?" That Mr. TH who used to serve in the military when I was little. Hayu interrupted, I've been away for too long, I don't remember. But what's the matter? Why are you mentioning him? Van continued her distressing story, oh my God, he's dead now. Later, he drove a bus, and died on the bus. And at that moment, I was on that bus, and it was me who took him to the cemetery. Hayu interrupted anxiously. But what's the connection if he's dead? What does it have to do with you? Van widened her eyes and emphasized. Well, he's been dead for a whole year. Suddenly, when I got on the bus earlier, he was the one driving. Hayu looked at her and burst into laughter, while Hayu's wife sarcastically interjected. You just arrived in Canada and watched too much TV. Talking nonsense like that, if you don't want to work, stay at home, don't make up ghost stories. Van, annoyed, got up and walked towards the refrigerator to get another glass of water and retorted. I'm telling the truth, I didn't make anything up. I saw Mr. TH himself driving the car. As soon as he saw me, he smiled and nodded at me. Oh God, I was so scared, I ran back immediately. The whole family fell silent, but clearly no one believed Van's words. After a while, the little girl Emlyn spoke up. Maybe you need to see a psychiatrist. Van sighed softly and angrily told Hayu. I'm so frustrated. I don't have any pictures of him. Just look at his face and you'll remember him right away. If you don't believe, then, tomorrow evening, you come to the bus station with me. Hayu mumbled. I have to go to bed early. I can't stay up and take you to work. And if you take a taxi, your salary won't be enough to pay for it. Then Hayu suddenly turned to his wife and asked. Do you remember Mr. TH? Hayu's wife nodded. I do. But I don't remember very clearly. When I first married you, I occasionally saw him passing by our house. I heard he died unexpectedly, like a sudden rupture of a blood vessel. That if he were to appear as a ghost, he would appear in Vietnam, not all the way here for a vacation. Speaking those words, Hayu's wife smiled as if mocking Van. Hayu quickly spoke up and told Van. I have a solution. Tomorrow evening, don't take the 9:30 bus like tonight. Make an effort to go earlier, catch the one around 9 o'clock. That way, you won't have to meet the driver from today. There are plenty of similar people in the world, but if you want to be sure, take a different route and avoid meeting the driver you claimed to be a ghost. Van responded contentedly. Yes, I was planning to do that. It's better to leave early anyway. There's no point in staying at home. It's more enjoyable to arrive at the shop earlier. Hayu knew that Van didn't want to stay at home, so he nodded and added. Yes, just do that. Make an effort to leave a bit earlier. Wait a moment, let me ask you something else. What about tonight? What about now? Are you going to work or not? Van remained silent, the image of Mr. TH still haunted her. Hayu got up and went to a corner of the house to make a phone call to Dolnut, a shop owned by a Chinese person who used to work at the same office as Hayu. After a brief conversation, he hung up and told Van. You can take the night off. They don't really need you tonight. Actually, they wanted you to come one day earlier for training, but it's already too late. You'll start tomorrow. Well, I'm going to bed now. Remember to lock the door. Hayu and his wife went upstairs, and little Emlyn followed them. Normally, she locked herself in her room to study or listen to music and rarely came downstairs. Her mother had a preconceived dislike for Van, but she remained indifferent and harbored no prejudice. Sometimes, when she had free time, she even patiently taught Van English. Everyone had gone upstairs, and Van lazily entered her bedroom to get her clothes and take a shower. She felt uncomfortable because there was no way to prove to her family that she had encountered a real ghost. As she stepped out, Van suddenly heard the neighbor's dog growling right outside her house, near the window of her room. With her arms embracing the clothes, Van furrowed her brows and listened. After a minute, it seemed like the dog leaped and its front paws continuously scratched against Van's house wall, making her even more annoyed. For nearly 3 months, the dog had never come to her yard, not even the backyard. It was as gentle as a lump of earth, lying idly on the veranda next to Hyu's house all day long. But tonight, the dog acted strangely, and Van slapped the wall a few times to drive it away. However, in a blink of an eye, the dog started howling in the silent night of the sparsely populated residential area, emitting a chilling and eerie sound. The scratching against the wall, the terrifying howling, and occasionally stifled barks continued. Van was extremely frustrated because if it kept barking like this, no one in the house could sleep. She intended to go upstairs and ask Hyu to call the neighbor on the phone and tell them to confine the dog. That neighbor was so strange. Why didn't they keep the dog inside the house instead of letting it roam freely in the yard during the cold season? With her arms holding the sleepwear, Van curiously pulled back the curtain, looking out into the backyard to see why the dog was barking. Instantly, she screamed in horror, dropped the clothes to the ground, and rushed outside because as soon as the curtain was pulled back, she saw Mr. TH standing right outside the window, grinning with his gleaming white teeth. As Van approached, only the light from inside the room shone out, and she could still clearly see his pale face, his radiant smile. The neighbor's dog kept rushing towards him, barking, and then retreating, growling from a distance, and then leaping towards him again as if chasing away a thief. Hyu came running down from upstairs and exclaimed, "What's happening? What's all this commotion about ghosts?" Van also ran out, intending to rush upstairs, and upon meeting Hyu, she gasped and said, "I just saw Mr. TH standing at the window of my room. And that neighbor's dog has been barking continuously since then." Worried, Hyu's wife also rushed out to see and angrily said to Van, "Which dog is barking? I haven't heard any dog barking since earlier. This woman is something else, causing so much fuss. She doesn't let people sleep, and tomorrow we have to go to work again." Hyu believed that his younger sister was experiencing a mental crisis due to a terrible event that had happened in the past in their hometown, so he gently said, "Did you hear any dogs barking? Emlyn is right, maybe she's really having a mental breakdown. Or maybe you should make an appointment to see a doctor tomorrow." While speaking, Hyu paced back and forth and entered Van's room. Van followed hesitantly, standing at the door, not daring to come in. Hyu stepped in, pulled back the curtain and looked out for a long time, but it was pitch dark outside. He told Van to turn off all the lights in the bedroom to see more clearly. He saw nothing in front of him except an empty stretch of land leading to the edge of the forest. On that empty land, there was only a fairly tall tree standing alone about 50 yards from Hyu's house. Tomorrow, the company would build and demolish it to build a house for sale. Hyu spread his hands and shrugged, telling Van, "There's nothing there. Look again. Look again, there's nothing." Van had been standing outside the door all this time. Hearing Hyu calling her, she couldn't bear it any longer and walked behind him, staring out and furrowing her brow. He was clearly standing there, right by this window. "I can't be mistaken. But, didn't you hear the dog barking? Strange, isn't it?" Hyu stepped out and frowned, saying, "Maybe you were dreaming, weren't you?" Van retorted, "I haven't even slept. I just entered the room, haven't even had a shower." Hugh concluded. Just go to sleep. Tomorrow, I'll go to work with your sister. Then Hugh quietly went upstairs. After Hugh left, Van stood silently, gazing at the window curtain. In the darkness of the night, she suddenly imagined that Mr. Th would reappear behind the glass and the white curtain. After a while, Van mustered up the courage to bend down and pick up the clothes that had fallen on the ground near the wall right below the window, then quickly ran to the bathroom. She turned on all the lights in the room, and when she looked in the mirror, she could still see traces of anxiety and faint unease. Half an hour later, Van returned to the room and stood still, listening intently. She didn't dare to close the door or turn off the lights. She even turned on the kitchen light before lying down on the bed, leaning her back towards the window, and covered herself with a blanket from head to toe. Hugh's wife came down from the upper floor and turned off all the lights in the kitchen to save electricity. Van knew, but she had to lie still. Fortunately, everything remained calm, nothing happened, the dog didn't howl or bark anymore. However, Van still couldn't sleep. She had a feeling outside the window that the ghostly presence was still lingering with its eerie face leaning against the door, waiting for her. When she closed her eyes, the pale green face of the old man with his yellow teeth appeared vividly before Van, as if he were standing right in front of her. When she was young, she heard adults say that those who died at the hour of the spirits would not be able to escape and would relentlessly pursue someone on earth. Could it be Mr. Th in that situation? If so, it was unfortunate for Van. After what seemed like an hour, probably well past midnight, Van cautiously sat up to use the restroom, then returned to bed, lost in deep thought for a long time. Perhaps the room was too bright for her to sleep, so Van reached out and turned off both overhead lights and the bedside lamp before curling up in the blanket. But as soon as the lights went out, the neighbor's dog in the backyard began to growl softly, and its front paw scratched against the wall with a squeaky sound, sending shivers down Van's spine. For some reason, Van covered her ears with her hands, but the dog howled, becoming more and more eerie with each passing moment. It barked continuously, and its metal claws continued to scrape against the wall. Van felt a chill run through her body, realizing that Mr. Th's spirit had just reappeared behind the house. The dog's barking was too loud in the late night. Why couldn't anyone else in the house hear it? Van waited anxiously, but there was no response from Hugh, indicating that only she could hear it. She curled up, hugging the pillow to her chest, closing her eyes tightly. After a while, the dog suddenly fell silent, and the sound of its paws scraping against the wall ceased. Van gently lowered the edge of the blanket from her face to breathe, but as soon as the dog fell silent for a moment, a loud rumbling noise of a car engine came from behind the house. It was the sound of a bus moving slowly, gradually growing louder until it passed right by her window. Her house was located in an empty field, with no roads where any vehicles could pass by the backyard. Van trembled and pulled the blanket over her face, closing her eyes. She vividly imagined the bus slowly approaching her house, passing by, and then turning back. And Mr. Th sat coldly behind the steering wheel. Van tried to wake up, turning on the light and grabbing the blanket as she rushed out to the kitchen, quietly going upstairs. She wanted to crawl into the bed with her niece to feel less afraid, but it was too late at night, and she didn't dare to wake her. Gradually, Van lay down on the floor, right by Emmeline's window, covering herself with the blanket. The next morning, the alarm clock woke Hugh up at 7 o'clock as usual. Almost every morning, he would wake up before his wife, go downstairs to read the newspaper, and drink coffee to wake up. He pushed the door open and was surprised to see Van curled up by the doorway. He stood there for a moment, realizing immediately that his sister-in-law didn't dare to sleep alone downstairs last night. He pitied her and walked lightly downstairs to avoid waking her up, but Van sat up, leaning against the wall, her disheveled hair and tired eyes, her eyes red and swollen, staring out the window. The sky was still dark, but it was already sunny at 7 o'clock in the summer. But in winter, the scenery was still unclear. Downstairs, Hugh turned on the bright lights, and Van sluggishly stood up, holding the blanket and heading downstairs. Hugh went into the bathroom and closed the door. While there was also a bathroom upstairs, it was mostly reserved for his wife and daughter because both of them spent a long time in there every morning, meticulously grooming themselves. Van cautiously approached the door of her room, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. She threw the blanket onto the bed and glanced at the window curtains, deciding to wait for the sky to brighten before pulling them back. She went to the kitchen to make coffee, waiting for Hugh. After a while, Hugh emerged from the bathroom, approached Van, and asked a redundant question. "Didn't you dare to sleep alone downstairs last night?" Weary, Van replied, "Hugh, do you have any way to accompany me tonight? You don't need to go to the cafe. Just stand and wait for the bus with me. Let me see if he shows up as the driver again or not. If he does, you can come with me on the bus. I don't dare to do it alone." Hugh understood that Van's spirit was in turmoil, but he couldn't believe that a ghost from Vietnam had come all the way here to pursue Van. He sternly retorted, "The bus doesn't wait only for you. Each trip carries dozens of people. Can a dead body drive a bus to take all those people to work?" "How can you say that?" Van interrupted, emphasizing, "But can you come with me to the bus station tonight?" He really wanted to accommodate her, and at the same time, he wanted to settle the matter once and for all. But he was afraid that his wife wouldn't agree, so he didn't know how to respond. Van placed the coffee cup down, looked out the window, and said, "It's already morning. Hugh, come with me outside, to the backyard." Hesitant, Hugh didn't want to go outside, but seeing how troubled Van had been throughout the night, he reluctantly stood up and said, "You can look out into the backyard from inside your room. No need to go outside and feel the cold." Van grabbed his arm firmly and insisted, "No, you come with me. I'm telling you, last night, Mr. Doe appeared right outside my room window. The neighbor's dog kept barking loudly, and it scratched the wall incessantly. Come on. Come with me." While speaking, Van dragged him to the back door, pushing it open and stepping outside, forgetting about the morning chill. Hugh followed, shivering from the cold. It was not yet fully dawn, but thanks to the vast empty space behind them, the scenery became clearer. Hugh turned on an additional lamp on the porch to see more clearly. He stood on the barren backyard, without a fence or cement coating, with the grass already withered from the cold. Suddenly, Hugh widened his eyes, startled, and opened his mouth in astonishment as he looked at the wall of their house, right beside Van's room window. It was indeed covered with numerous scratch marks as if someone intentionally scraped it with a nail. The house was newly built, and the scratches were more evident on the intact wall. Van shook Hugh's shoulder and said fearfully, "Do you see it? I told you, the dog scratched that clock sound. And look here, footprints right outside the window of my bedroom. Clearly, they are shoe prints imprinted on the soft ground. No one has ever come to this backyard. It was only last night when I was in my room downstairs that I felt scared and had to run upstairs." Hugh also noticed the man's shoe print facing Van's room, causing him to change his attitude. A sudden chill ran through his body, and he silently turned his head to look at the neighbor's house with a dog that had always been friendly. Then he grabbed Van's hand, signaling her to go inside, and closed the door behind them. He went out to the front yard, looking around anxiously. The neighbor's dog was peacefully lying in front of its porch, showing no signs of encountering any ghostly presence last night. Hugh said to Van, "Or could it be a thief spying on our house? Van shook her head. Behind our house is an empty plot of land. Which thief would dare to stand out in the open, lurking there? Hugh had also considered that possibility, but he still tried to come up with a hypothesis to comfort himself. Inside the house, he sat at the dining table, his eyes lost in thought. Van poured coffee for him and placed it in front of him. Hugh asked, "That Mr. Thu said appeared as a ghost, did he have any connection to you when he was alive? Why would he come back to haunt and tease you?" Van pulled up a chair and meticulously recounted every detail to Hugh, except this time she was more excited because Hugh had attentively listened without dismissing her story like the previous night. She concluded, "Will you be willing to pick me up by bus tonight?" Hugh nodded and replied, "Yes, I'll go with you tonight, but I want you to wait a little longer before waking your sister-in-law up. Don't say anything. She's easily frightened, and if she knows there's a real ghost, she might have a heart attack." Van nodded, although she felt frustrated inside because it was clear that her sister-in-law thought she was making things up, assuming Van was using an excuse to stay home and avoid going to work. In her anger, Van only wished for the ghost to appear once to scare her sister-in-law. Van stood up and said, "All right, you get ready for work. I need to get some sleep. I had a sleepless night, and I'm exhausted. I thought of sharing a bed with My Lin, but I'm afraid I'll disturb her sleep, so I'll have to sleep in the corridor." He remained silent and thoughtful. Van looked at him earnestly and asked, "Can I make a phone call to Vietnam?" Hugh, surprised, lifted his coffee cup and replied, "Sure, but who do you want to call?" "I want to call Mr. Do's family. He's staying with his older brother, and I told them to hold a memorial ceremony because Mr. Do doesn't have a wife or children to pay respects." He took a sip of his coffee and nodded, saying, "Sure, it's up to you. When I leave for work later, you can make the call." Van stood up contentedly. Although they cared for each other, they had to deal with a difficult sister-in-law. So, Van hesitated about anything she wanted to do. She entered the bathroom, relieved that the fear from the previous night had diminished now that it was morning. She brushed her teeth, washed her face, and then put on a bathrobe before filling the bathtub with hot water to soothe her tiredness. She then entered her room, closed the door, and lay down on the bed. Outside, Hugh and their 6-year-old daughter had left, locking the door behind them, leaving Van alone in the empty house. She needed a long nap to be able to work at the coffee shop tonight. Van had only slept for a few hours when she woke up in the middle of the silent house. After a few seconds of reflection, she remembered the entire story from the previous night, from seeing Mr. Do's wax-like face on the bus to the chaotic sounds behind the house, the barking of dogs, scratching against the wall, and the sound of the bus driving away. Everything rushed back quickly into her memory. However, as she looked through the window curtain, she saw that the sun was shining brightly, and the feeling of fear no longer weighed heavily on her as it did the previous night. Glancing at the clock on the table, she realized it was already past noon. Van got up with the intention of washing her face and cooking rice. As she emerged from under the thick blanket, she shivered from the cold, hastily put on a jacket, and then pulled open the curtains wider, allowing more light into the room. As the curtain was pulled back, she let out a terrified scream and took a few steps back. In front of the vast open field, about 50 paces from her house, stood a tall pine tree, its leaves mostly fallen by now. A man leaned against the tree trunk, with a lit cigarette in his mouth, gazing intently at Van's bedroom window. Despite the considerable distance, Van immediately recognized him as Mr. Th, unmistakable in his familiar posture. Just as Van saw him, coinciding with the moment she pulled back the curtain, he turned and walked away towards the edge of the forest, disappearing within. Van placed her hand on her chest to calm herself down, too afraid to draw the curtain back again. She hurried outside to check if the front door was securely closed and the latch properly fastened. At the same time, she counted the number of windows in the house. Van pulled open all the curtains, thinking that ghosts are always afraid of light. So, this evening, when Hayu returned from work, she would ask him to replace the dim light bulb near her window with a brighter one, and from now on, she would not close the curtains while sleeping. Standing at the dining table lost in thought, her heart still pounding, the silent and eerie house made her feel as if she were living alone in an abandoned castle. While speaking, Van dragged him to the back door, pushing it open and stepping outside, forgetting about the morning chill. Hayu followed, shivering from the cold. It was not yet fully dawn, but thanks to the vast empty space behind them, the scenery became clearer. Hayu turned on an additional lamp on the porch to see more clearly. He stood on the barren backyard, without a fence or cement coating, with the grass already withered from the cold. Suddenly, Hayu widened his eyes, startled, and opened his mouth in astonishment as he looked at the wall of their house, right beside Van's room window. It was indeed covered with numerous scratch marks as if someone intentionally scraped it with a nail. The house was newly built, and the scratches were more evident on the intact wall. Van shook Hayu's shoulder and said fearfully, "Do you see it? I told you, the dog scratched that clock sound. And look here, footprints right outside the window of my bedroom. Clearly, they are shoe prints imprinted on the soft ground. No one has ever come to this backyard. It was only last night when I was in my room downstairs that I felt scared and had to run upstairs." Hayu also noticed the man's shoe print facing Van's room, causing him to change his attitude. A sudden chill ran through his body, and he silently turned his head to look at the neighbor's house with a dog that had always been friendly. Then he grabbed Van's hand, signaling her to go inside, and closed the door behind them. He went out to the front yard, looking around anxiously. The neighbor's dog was peacefully lying in front of its porch, showing no signs of encountering any ghostly presence last night. Hayu said to Van, "Or could it be a thief spying on our house?" Van shook her head. "Behind our house is an empty plot of land. Which thief would dare to stand out in the open, lurking there?" Hayu had also considered that possibility, but he still tried to come up with a hypothesis to comfort himself. Inside the house, he sat at the dining table, his eyes lost in thought. Van poured coffee for him and placed it in front of him. Hayu asked, "That Mr. Thu said appeared as a ghost, did he have any connection to you when he was alive? Why would he come back to haunt and tease you?" Van pulled up a chair and meticulously recounted every detail to Hugh, except this time she was more excited because Hugh had attentively listened without dismissing her story like the previous night. She concluded, "Will you be willing to pick me up by bus tonight?" Hugh nodded and replied, "Yes, I'll go with you tonight, but I want you to wait a little longer before waking your sister-in-law up. Don't say anything. She's easily frightened, and if she knows there's a real ghost, she might have a heart attack." Van nodded, although she felt frustrated inside because it was clear that her sister-in-law thought she was making things up, assuming Van was using an excuse to stay home and avoid going to work. In her anger, Van only wished for the ghost to appear once to scare her sister-in-law. Van stood up and said, "All right, you get ready for work. I need to get some sleep. I had a sleepless night, and I'm exhausted. I thought of sharing a bed with My Lin, but I'm afraid I'll disturb her sleep, so I'll have to sleep in the corridor." He remained silent and thoughtful. Van looked at him earnestly and asked, "Can I make a phone call to Vietnam?" Hugh, surprised, lifted his coffee cup and replied, "Sure, but who do you want to call?" "I want to call Mr. Doe's family. He's staying with his older brother, and I told them to hold a memorial ceremony because Mr. Doe doesn't have a wife or children to pay respects. Hugh took a sip of his coffee and nodded, saying, "Sure, it's up to you. When I leave for work later, you can make the call." Van stood up contentedly. Although they cared for each other, they had to deal with a difficult sister-in-law. So, Van hesitated about anything she wanted to do. She entered the bathroom, relieved that the fear from the previous night had diminished now that it was morning. She brushed her teeth, washed her face, and then put on a bathrobe before filling the bathtub with hot water to soothe her tiredness. She then entered her room, closed the door, and lay down on the bed. Outside, Hugh and their 6-year-old daughter had left, locking the door behind them, leaving Van alone in the empty house. She needed a long nap to be able to work at the coffee shop tonight. Wife Hugh sat on the bench, silent, although she still remembered Mr. Doe's face. Before Hugh could finish his sentence, My Lin, who was standing next to him, spoke up. "Oh? The bus is coming." Both Hugh and Van turned anxiously towards the slowly approaching bus. Hugh's wife was even more excited because she hoped for this moment to laugh at her sister-in-law's face. The four of them stood in a line, not saying a word. Under the streetlights shining through the misty air, the grey bus emerged like the silhouette of a giant monster haunting Van's mind. She held her breath and silently repeated the words she had said earlier. "Although you're supposed to be in heaven. Please don't appear and scare me." It seemed like the bus was empty, with no passengers. As it approached the station, it slowed down and veered to the curb before coming to a complete stop. Hugh's wife, Hugh, Van, and My Lin, all four of them were tense, staring wide-eyed, waiting. Then the bus doors swung open, and the driver turned his head with an indifferent gaze. Van stood still like a statue, causing Hugh to push her back and urge her to step on. The driver was just an ordinary Canadian man in a uniform, holding a ready-made ticket with the habit of handing it to passengers. Hugh was very happy. He breathed a sigh of relief as if he had lifted a 1,000-pound burden, but he had to pretend to scold Van to please his wife. "Can't you see? He's just an ordinary person." "All right, go to work. We'll meet again tomorrow morning." Little My Lin asked Hugh. "Is this the one, Dad?" "Aunt Van said he's a ghost, Dad." Hugh's wife laughed and told her daughter. "Ha! If you call him a ghost, then I meet hundreds of ghosts every day on the street." Hugh shrugged and said to his wife, "But if I didn't come, our Van wouldn't have stopped arguing. All right, let's calm down and go home to sleep." Van stepped on the bus, finding a seat at the back. She was both happy and nervous. Her eyes were fixed on the driver's back. She believed in her silent plea to Mr. Doe's departed soul. He wouldn't appear to scare her anymore. From now on, Van hoped to be safe. In any case, she would perform rituals to pray for Mr. Doe's soul and place his picture in the temple regularly. There were fewer than 10 passengers on the bus, and Van observed each man's face, feeling relieved and relaxed. Only after the bus closed its doors and started moving did Hugh and his wife feel at ease. Hugh's wife began to blame her husband. "I told you he was pretending, but you didn't believe me. Now you only believe your younger sister. You don't believe anything I say." Hugh knew that Van couldn't imagine what had happened in his house since last night, but he didn't want his wife to know, so he had to come up with an excuse. "I've already said it. I came out here to see it with my own eyes to end the argument." Hugh's wife still didn't let it go. "You don't regret coming out here. But what's frustrating is that no matter what it said, you listened to it, even though it was so unreasonable. Instead of confronting it, you seemed to be obediently following it." Hugh didn't say anything more, quietly walking beside his wife and child, because he knew that even if he tried to explain, his wife wouldn't believe him, as she already had a prejudice against Van. Their little daughter, Mai Lin, made a suggestion. Maybe Aunt Van is obsessed because she watches too much TV at home. Hugh's wife immediately picked up on that comment and reiterated, exactly. What else could it be? I've already said it. Only you and your father believe in ghosts. It's such an absurd thing, even the child doesn't believe it anymore. When they arrived home, Hugh's wife stepped up and opened the door, her face still filled with anger. Hugh and their daughter stood in the courtyard. The little girl asked Hugh if he could take her to Toronto for her friend's birthday party on Saturday. Hugh nodded and said, sure, no matter what, I'll take Aunt Van to the temple. Hugh's wife pushed open the door, reached out to turn on the light, and hung the keychain on the hook on the wall. Suddenly, she furrowed her brows in annoyance upon hearing the sound of running water from the bathroom, and the light was still on. Only Van used the downstairs bathroom, so before leaving, Van had forgotten to turn off the light and the water. The wife walked quickly inside, grinding her teeth in frustration at Van's carelessness, wasting electricity and water, despite her repeated reminders. Standing in front of the bathroom door, the wife became even more irritated because Van had only forgotten to turn off the hot water tap at the sink, and water had been running for almost half an hour, causing steam to fill the room, obstructing her view. She waved her hand with a bath towel, trying to clear the dense vapor in front of her eyes before finding her way in. She fumbled to tighten the hot water tap and then used the towel to wipe away the thick layer of steam on the mirror in front of her. She sighed with relief and looked up into the mirror. Suddenly, she screamed loudly, dropping the towel and falling backward into the bathroom, startled. The reason was that when she looked into the mirror, she didn't see her own face, but instead, she saw Do's shiny wax-like white face.